You're listening to Three Things to Know with Stephanie Haney. The people you want to hear from and the things you need to know in Northeast Ohio and beyond. Get in the know, stay in the know. Starting right now.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome back to the Three Things to Know podcast. I'm Stephanie Haney, and I am so glad that you're here to join me to talk about the current state of affairs and what we can expect moving forward. Because let me tell you, 2021 really coming in hot. To say that we are in a time of unrest right now is a dramatic understatement. We are just coming off of deadly riots in Washington, D.C. that happened on January 6th, and a moment in time where the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has just made history by becoming the first U.S. president to be impeached twice. Trump has now been charged with inciting an insurrection, which, if you're not familiar with that word, that is a violent uprising against the government. And now he'll face a trial in the Senate. What we're looking at related to those riots in Washington, D.C. are suspensions of Capitol Police officers, investigations into other officers. The chief stepped down. And this time of division is not only between Democrats and Republicans and people who support President Trump and are not for the eventual inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden, which is happening on January 20th, but also within the Republican Party. And this is definitely something that we're seeing across the country. It's definitely something that we're seeing here in the state of Ohio. There were people here in the state of Ohio that went to Washington, D.C. and participated in those riots. And let's not forget, the state of Ohio went for President Donald Trump in the 2020 election. And that's something that we haven't seen happen when a Democrat actually won the White House since 1960. And yet, Joe Biden did still win the White House. And now we find ourselves in a situation where the Democrats will control not only the White House and the House of Representatives, but also the Senate, because those two runoff Senate elections in Georgia, they went blue. So that's for at least the next 2 years, because that's when the midterm elections will be, and then we'll see what happens there. But with all of this in mind, a lot of people are wondering, what difference does it really make? What kind of an impact will a Joe Biden presidency have here in the state of Ohio, a state that flips red to blue, even though it's been turning red a little bit more lately, leaning that way if you take a look at the data? Well, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a politician, and I'm definitely not a psychic. So to get us in the know on this, the guests that I have for you this week, they're not psychics, but they are politicians and political experts. This is a two-part episode this week, talking with both Democrats and Republicans to see what impact they think a Biden presidency will have here in Ohio. So first up, I had a conversation with Democratic US Senator Sherrod Brown just days after the riot in the Capitol. This is before President Trump was formally impeached again. So keep that in mind as you listen. Here's that conversation now. Senator Brown, thank you so much for joining me on the Three Things to Know podcast today.
Thanks. Good to be with you. Thanks, Stephanie.
Let's start with where we are right now. The whole country is reeling from the riots that happened in D.C. while the Congress was working to certify the Electoral College. And that's a symptom of the distrust and the division that we're seeing across the country and here in Ohio, a state which voted for President Donald Trump. So how do you think Joe Biden taking office will impact the mood here in Ohio?
Well, it depends in part on, the division. When you talk division, understand that it's the President of the United States continuing to lie about this election. Every single elections official in the country, including many Republicans, are saying this was the fairest, most efficient, most honest election in years, yet the president continues to say it wasn't a legitimate election. And you see most of his political party either defend him and regurgitate those lies, or you see them ominously silent. Therefore, most Trump voters believe that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president. These elected officials, Trump's not going to do it. These elected officials need to stand up and say, this was an honest election. It was a fair election. My guy lost. I was for Hillary Clinton at 16. You lose sometimes, but they need to say that to heal these divisions.
Speaking of those elected officials that are so important to this process, can you just walk me through what it was like to be there in the Capitol when these rioters broke into the building, to be sheltering with all of your colleagues?
Yeah, we had no idea anything was happening. We weren't watching news. We were listening to each other debate in an isolated chamber that way on the Senate floor. Only when Senator Romney started to leave and was trying to go out the door, and they stopped him, which they normally wouldn't have done. Then when the Capitol Police or the Sergeant at Arms took the vice president, ushered him out of the room as he was presiding, then we knew something was up. They locked the doors. Then half an hour later, they ushered us or sent us or led us into a room with 75 US senators sitting there waiting for 4.5 hours, not really knowing what was happening, except they brought a TV in and we watched CNN to see what was happening. So it was troubling by any standard. And, even my Republican colleagues who are total Trump people, overwhelmingly they acknowledged that Trump incited these rioters and that's got to stop. So I'm hopeful that people learned their lesson, that senators that have continued to make excuses for the president's lies will finally stand up and say, this is a legitimately elected president. Whether you agree or disagree with him, we've got to work together.
Certainly glad that you're okay, that our elected officials are okay. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for everyone in Washington, D.C. during those riots, but there were some lives lost. There is still conversation, though, that there may have been a double standard in how these protests turned riots were treated versus how Black Lives Matter demonstrations have been treated. What do you think about that?
Well, there is no question that these rioters were treated very differently from Black Lives Matter protesters, peaceful protesters at the Lincoln Memorial, where nobody lives or nobody works except for Abe Lincoln, sitting in a marble Abe Lincoln sitting on a big chair there. There's no question if these had been Black Lives Matter activists, that many more would have been arrested and likely many more would have been killed in this kind of situation. The police treated the protesters, many in wheelchairs that sat in Mitch McConnell's office and protested peacefully opposed to Medicaid cuts. Police treated them much more roughly and more combatively, if you will, than these white supremacist protesters. So we've got we've got to, as a nation, understand that better and take action. That these are white supremacists. They were violent. They did something nobody's ever done since the War of 1812 when the British invaded the Capitol. They need to be held accountable, and those people that incited them, from the president to Rudy Giuliani to the president's son, need also to be accountable for this.
We talk about accountability for this and a lot of conversation about President Trump's role in this. You have been very outspoken calling for the invoking of the 25th Amendment, and if that doesn't happen, for impeachment in the House and then to move to a trial in the Senate. Now, why do you think that's important right now at this late stage in the presidency for Donald Trump?
I never thought I would say something like that, to call for the invoking the 25th Amendment. I didn't agree with President Bush on much of anything, especially his handling of the Iraq War and trade agreements that he jammed through the Senate. But I would never have called for the 25th Amendment to remove him from office. I'm hopeful that the vice president and the cabinet will do that. If they don't, we may have to move to impeachment quickly. We need to do it quickly. But this isn't to punish the president or, he deserves punishment, but this isn't really to punish the president or for vengeance. This is to stop what could happen to our national security in the next 12 days. If we don't act, there's no telling what this president will do next. Nobody would have predicted that he would incite people to riot in the Capitol. That had never happened, really. So we don't know what's next, but we're all concerned what he might use the military to do in the next 11 or 12 days.
As we look toward the inauguration happening on January 20th, let's take a look forward now on some different topics. I want to talk about the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, specifically, President Trump has said, we've got the vaccine to the states. From there, it's your responsibility. Do you think the Biden administration might take a different approach when it comes to getting the vaccine where it needs to go?
Well, first, President-elect Biden said he is not going to hold back the second round. He's going to get all of those vaccines out to as many people as possible, then prepare for the second round as it comes 3 weeks later, in the case of Pfizer anyway. I think the difference with Biden, Trump has hardly mentioned the vaccine or COVID since the election. It's all been about him and the what he said about the election that has been proven to not be true. But Biden will focus on that. Biden understands, instead of playing off Ohio against Pennsylvania, against Michigan, against West Virginia, which is what Trump did on the COVID and on the virus overall and what he's doing in the pandemic, that the federal government's got to work with the states instead of setting them one against another in a competition. And that will be the big difference, that there will be a full focus. It's going to be Biden's number one priority, as it should be. We voted last week, 2 weeks ago, $30 billion for the states to make sure they can carry this out with the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, the way we used to do things in this country, where the CDC was head of all public health. I mean, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, essentially led the effort in the world to eliminate polio and smallpox. It's the best in the world. They should be doing this, and they should be working with the states directly on the coronavirus vaccine.
Another thing very important to Ohioans here is the stimulus package. Now, we did recently see that $600 payment. We know President Trump had called for a $2,000 check for most Americans who fall within those salary thresholds. Joe Biden has said that we will see additional relief coming. What do you think we'll see there? Do you think we'll see another single check or potentially recurring payments?
I think we will see an expansion of unemployment benefits to anybody that's unemployed and on a livable wage, something closer to $600 a week than the $300 a week. I think you'll see more rental assistance for emergencies, where so many people are about to be evicted in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of the winter. I think you'll see more help for small businesses, so they can keep alive for the next 3 or 4 months till everybody can be vaccinated. I think you'll see more help for local governments, not just for vaccine distribution, but for schools. We've got to open our schools, and we've got to see our teachers vaccinated and then open the schools quickly so kids can go to school in person. That is so important for their future and for our economy, so that parents can then more comfortably and ably go back to work. All of those things. And I think we'll see an additional check similar to what President Trump wanted and what House Democrats wanted, that Senator McConnell blocked. I think we will do that too. We promised to do that. I think you'll see all of that from the next recovery bill. And then the good news is, once we come out of this, the vaccines once we get people vaccinated, when we come out of this virus, there is so much pent-up economic demand that the economy is going to start growing rapidly once the coronavirus is behind us. And that's really the good news by spring or summer, that this economy really potentially can be really humming along finally.
I'm glad you bring up the economy. Here, particularly in Ohio, the economy was ranked number 2, only behind COVID-19, as an important voting issue for Ohioans in the Your Voice Ohio Bliss Institute poll. So just taking a look at what that looked like under President Trump. He started 5.2% unemployment here in Ohio. The most recent data we have, 5.7% unemployment here in Ohio. Do you think we'll see any difference there impacted by a Biden presidency on the unemployment rate here in Ohio?
Yeah, we saw 10 years of economic growth from the early Obama administration up until this spring, when President Trump essentially bungled the response to COVID. I mean, there was clearly going to be a hit to our economy, but he has not done particularly well since to get the economy growing and to sustain it during this, because we keep getting set back on the virus. I'm optimistic, though, that once the virus is behind us, that we will bring that unemployment rate significantly down, because there's so much pent-up demand, including a lot of people in this country who during the coronavirus have actually saved money. I mean, there's a whole lot of essential workers that are struggling. A whole lot of people were laid off, but a whole lot of people work out of their homes and have done pretty well financially. They're going to be spending money. As people going back to work will be spending money. And that only means one thing. That means one big thing, and that is that the economy will grow again.
Something else that experts say would potentially be a benefit to the economy is student loan forgiveness. This is something that Senate now minority leader, but presumptive majority leader Chuck Schumer has talked about. Something that he mentioned specifically was that Joe Biden, in his view, could forgive up to $50,000 per person in student loan debt by executive order on his own. Now we're in a situation where the Democrats will control the White House, the House, and the Senate with that tie-breaking vote. What do you think will happen there?
Oh, I think I neglected to mention that when I mentioned emergency rental assistance, larger unemployment help for small businesses, help for local governments, and especially schools. I neglected to say student loans. Yes, that's part of this Stimulus Recovery Act. I mean, too many people in sort of your generation, Stephanie, people your age and younger coming out of school are so saddled with debt that they can't start that business. They can't buy a house. They can't do the things that young people of previous generations might have been able to do. And I think we especially pay attention. We know that because of Jim Crow and redlining, that African Americans especially have had much less advantage in coming into the marketplace after school and starting a business or buying a home and all that. So we pay special attention there. But student loans forgiveness is a major component of that.
Do you think it will go as far as Senator Schumer said, $50,000 per person?
I have no idea how much it will be. I do think we'll pay special attention to people that have debt from for-profit colleges. They were so exploited and deceived. And I mean, I don't know if they were criminal acts or they sure looked like it to me. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it will be significant. I have no idea if it'll be anything close to the numbers that I've heard from some other people.
Switching gears now, something, of course, that's kind of been ground zero here in Ohio has been the opioid epidemic and addiction. Now, President Trump, early in his presidency, 2017, he did declare the opioid epidemic a national emergency. However, this year in Ohio, opioid-related deaths are on pace to break the record that was set in 2017. There were about 4,900 opioid-related deaths that year, and based on what we've seen, of course, it takes some time because they have to, test those deaths and so forth. We don't know exactly where those numbers are right now. Do you think a Joe Biden presidency makes a difference here in Ohio when it comes to the opioid epidemic?
Unfortunately, during this coronavirus, the term opioid epidemic hardly was heard. I know that. I mean, you've I know covered it and been interested in it for a long time, but it just didn't get the attention during the pandemic, and the number of opioid deaths, as you suggest, Stephanie, has continued to plague the state. Our state is hit harder than almost any state in the country. We need to refocus Medicaid, mental health counseling, all the things. We need to scale up our clinics that simply are overwhelmed with COVID. Now they're overwhelmed. They were overwhelmed with opioid addiction issues and in care, and then overwhelmed with COVID. And together, it's a burden that this state's not been able to deal with very well. So we've got to shift attention there and make sure that we look at what's next on opioids for sure.
It is something that the conversation has sort of gone to the wayside on it, and we have seen from mental health professionals that addiction does seem to be also something that's been tied to COVID, unfortunately. Switching gears now. Go ahead.
One more thing. In your home county, in Stark County, it's been especially a problem. It's been a problem everywhere, but Stark has been hit especially hard. And you combine the virus with eviction, with potential drug problems, and they all feed on each other. And you're more likely to be evicted if you are addicted to opioids. You're more likely to, and if you're evicted, you're more likely to fall into drug use and more likely to get COVID. I mean, there's just not places. I mean, it's insane that we don't address all of these issues together, because eviction in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of the winter, in the middle of an opioid crisis is going to contribute to so much more hardship and death for so many families.
That is something that Joe Biden has also talked about on the record. He said he doesn't think that people should go to jail for drug use. So it'll be very interesting to see what kind of an approach is taken when it comes to those specific things that you just mentioned here in Ohio under a Biden presidency. I know a lot of people will be watching out for that because, as we say, so many people are touched by COVID, so many people are touched by the opioid epidemic as well, and you may not even realize it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I remember, and at the same time, and I appreciate Governor Kasich doing this years ago, expanding Medicaid. I was in a mental health center in Cincinnati, and with a man in his 30-ish-year-old daughter, and he put his arm in he put his hand on her arm, and he said, if it weren't for Medicaid expansion, my daughter would be dead, because she had gotten the kind of counseling and treatment that she needed, that she was recovering. She wasn't out of the woods yet. But it really takes the focus of government working with local communities and local hospitals on this.
Wow. Let's talk about another drug-related issue on the complete opposite side of the spectrum. Let's talk about legalizing marijuana. Now, Joe Biden has said he's been in favor of decriminalizing low-level marijuana possession, also medical use. Those are things that are already happening here in Ohio. Medical use already legal here in Ohio, and county by county, we're seeing decriminalization. Do you think a Joe Biden presidency will have an impact on legalizing recreational cannabis use here in Ohio?
I don't know. I know he's talked about it. I know and it's not a especially partisan issue. But the first thing we look at, though, is the difference in sentencing. We know that African Americans are so much more likely to go to jail for possession of the same amount of marijuana that somebody that looks like me might have that doesn't go to jail. And so whatever we do on marijuana legalization for recreational use, the term you point out, Stephanie, needs to always consider discrepancies and differentials and discrimination and sentencing, how important that is as part of this discussion.
As we turn toward the inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden, I want to talk about just very briefly the state of the Democratic Party here in Ohio. Ohio, once considered a crucial swing state. This year, President Trump won Ohio. That's the first time that a Democrat has won the presidency without winning Ohio since 1960. So as we see these southern states turning more blue, Ohio seems to be turning more red. Do you have any comment about what the Democratic Party is doing to try and become competitive again within Ohio?
Yeah, I mean, the people will vote for Democrats in Ohio. But we need to speak more. We need to speak to rural voters better than we do. We need to be seen. I mean, the African Americans surely vote 8 or 9 to 1 for Democrats, but Democrats don't speak directly to them to encourage them to vote in larger numbers and encouraging working class voters in larger numbers. But I think it's a combination of speaking to smaller communities, places like where I grew up, Mansfield, Democrats don't do very well. But in Franklin County, Columbus, Hamilton County, Cincinnati, we do better than we've ever done. So we need to be a party that speaks to the dignity of work, because the dignity of work cuts across all income categories and all geographic regions. Someone in Zanesville or Ravenna has the same desire as someone in Akron to get a decent job with decent wages and decent benefits. That means passing the PRO Act so workers can belong to unions in higher numbers. They're much more likely to vote for Democrats because of that. It means reinstating the overtime rule that President Trump scaled back, in minimum wage, and all the things we can do, because if we're the party of workers, we win. And that's what my career is about. And we know that's a winning formula. And it's what we ought to be doing, because the dignity of work is who we all are as a nation.
As we look toward the Biden inauguration, is there one particular issue that you think will make the biggest impact, a Biden presidency will have the biggest impact on here in Ohio?
Well, I think the Biden presidency is going to be two things. It's initially going to be deal with this coronavirus decisively and as one people, and put that behind us and grow the economy as you do it. The second thing is Joe Biden ran for president talking about, he was the most pro-worker candidate for president in my lifetime. And that means it means dignity of work. It's whether you punch a clock or swipe a badge, whether you work for tips, whether you're working on a salary like you are, whether it's working, it's taking care of kids or taking care of parents or raising children. And I think Joe Biden will go down as a very pro-worker president, and that will mean he'll have a successful presidency.
My final question for you, Senator Brown, are there any big question marks in your mind when it comes to what will happen with the Joe Biden presidency for us here in Ohio?
No big question marks. He's a pretty predictable guy. He was in Cleveland the day before the election campaigning. I got to talk to him a little bit. I mean, his mind was on the next day. His mind was on election day. So it wasn't the most in-depth conversation, but I've known him well enough over really decades, a couple of decades now, that I think he predictably will fight for workers. He will be an appealing presence in Ohio. I know he lost Ohio. Ohio is, as you point out, Stephanie, increasingly harder for a Democrat to win. But I won here decisively only a couple of years ago. Joe Biden's politics now are not much different from mine, and I think people will get more and more appreciate the work he does to help people get jobs, to raise wages, to provide health and pension benefits to people, and into small businesses to provide those jobs increasingly, and that will matter.
It's definitely an interesting political time with Democratic control of the House, the Senate, and the White House for at least the next 2 years, and we definitely look forward to see what happens over the next 4. Thank you very much for your time today, Senator
Thanks.
Brown. I appreciate it.
Good question, Stephanie. Thanks so much. See ya.
Now, in the time since I spoke to Senator Brown, we do know a little bit more about what Joe Biden is planning for at least this first initial round of third COVID-19 relief. He's calling it his American Rescue Plan. We do know that it does include $1,400 checks to most Americans, combined with that $600 that many people received in December and January. That comes to the $2,000 total that Democrats were calling for previously. Other things included in that package: extended unemployment, rent relief, food assistance, aid to small businesses, and a plan to keep essential workers on the job, those frontline workers. Now, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer have said that they will work quickly to pass this after his inauguration on January 20th. The question of will we see more in terms of more checks, whether they're recurring or more single payments, we'll just have to wait and see. And in part 2 of this podcast, I get the Republican perspective about the impact a Joe Biden presidency will have here in Ohio from Republican strategist Mehek Cooke. She served as legal advisor to former Republican Ohio Governor John Kasich when he ran against Trump for the Republican nomination in 2016, which eventually, as we know, led to Trump's presidency. Now, just so everyone is aware, I did reach out to Republican lawmakers that represent Northeast Ohio in the Capitol, but they were not available. Senators Rob Portman and Representative Anthony Gonzalez were simply not available. Representative Bill Johnson's schedule was too uncertain with the House impeachment effort, according to his people, and Representative David Joyce's people did get back to me. They were willing to schedule something, but it was too late in order to make it for this podcast. I did not hear anything back from the offices of Representative Jim Jordan and Representative Bob Gibbs. So, with that in mind, come back for part 2. I'll have the Republican viewpoint from Republican advisor Mehek Cooke, and 3 News' Brandon Simmons will also join me for what you need to know in NEO. And of course, I will have your good follow on social media like we do every single week. See ya on the other side.
Thanks for listening to 3 Things to Know with Stephanie Haney from WKYC Studios. Subscribe now to stay in the know.